Well, hey everybody. As Lou said earlier, my name is Michael. My wife Emily, our awesome team, we have the privilege or we're just crazy enough to be starting a church in the fall of this year here on Long Island. We're going to be calling our church Local Church, mainly because, it's great. And you're all invited. Mainly we're calling it Local Church because the name Community Church was already taken, so we just went with the second best thing. But honestly, I'm so honored to be here with you guys. I love this place so much. I love Lou, I love Tom, I love all of you guys. I love everything that Community Church does. I love the way it feels here and looks here. And honestly, when I think about what Local Church is going to feel like and look like in the future, I think it's going to be like 99.9% of what this place is like. The only thing that we're probably not going to have that you guys do have is Lou's hair, because I just don't think I'm cool enough to rock that hairstyle. So anyway, really honored to be here. I love the mission of Community Church to help change people's mind about the way they see God. And so today we're in part 3 of a series that we're calling Storyteller. And I hope that as we look at another story that Jesus told, that maybe for some of us we'll change the way we think about and see God as a result of this story. So we're looking at a story because Jesus was a master storyteller. In fact, he was just a master communicator. As somebody who regularly has to prepare speeches like this one and stand up on a Sunday morning and talk to people and try to fumble my way to a cohesive point, I am constantly amazed at the ability that Jesus had to step onto the scene and in 1 or 2 sentences silence his audience and leave them in awe and wonder at his wisdom, right? He could just ask one question and everybody would be like, oh my gosh. I mean, he would talk about things and the audience was an expert in whatever he was talking about, and they would be amazed because Jesus was an incredible communicator and storyteller. And so today we're going to look at a story that Jesus tells in order to expound upon something that I think most of us are probably familiar with. It's called the Golden Rule. I'm sure you've heard some version of this rule at some point in your life. In fact, every major religion has its own version of the Golden Rule, but they all pretty much say the same thing. See, the Christian version of the Golden Rule is simply love your neighbor as yourself. If you want to get real old school with it, it's love thy neighbor as thyself. It sounds a little more formal. And so we're going to look at a story that Jesus tells where he expounds upon what it looks like to live according to the golden rule, but also where he helps to change somebody's mind about what God thinks about what's most important. See, because there's a person in the story, or the person that Jesus is telling the story to, does what I can tend to do so often. Maybe you can relate to this. Because whenever somebody places a rule in your life, you either have one of 3 options. You can obey it, you can ignore it, or you can challenge it in some way. Look for some sort of exceptions or loopholes to the rule. And so there's this character in the story that Jesus is talking to who is looking for a loophole, and then Jesus tells a story in an effort to help change his thinking. So this guy, I can really relate to this guy because I find myself in that third category of challenging rules all the time. I don't care who's giving them. It could be my dad, my teacher, a coach, God. I often am looking for all the loopholes. So when I see a rule like this, the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, immediately I'm thinking of ways to challenge it. So a couple questions come to mind for me, and I think, all right, if I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, what is love? What is love anyway? Maybe your definition of love is different than my definition of love. And who qualifies as my neighbor, really? Is it just the houses that are immediately next to mine? Is it just my street? Is it a radius thing, maybe 1 mile, 5 mile? Who qualifies to be my neighbor? And finally, maybe the most important question for a rule like this is, do you really want me to love other people the way I love myself? I mean, let's be real. We live on Long Island. Do we really love ourselves very well? I mean, if my wife were to ask me, how come you don't show me more affection? My standard answer is, do you have food on the table? Do you have a roof over your head? That's how I love you, right? Not really. I don't treat her that. You guys are like, this guy's a pastor. That's how he treats his wife. No, So I tend to try to challenge the rules as much as possible, but I thought, well, since I have to teach about this and talk about this, I better do my best to do this well. So I was thinking, how could I practice the golden rule? And so I thought, I went to my wife, Emily, and I was like, Emily, what if next Valentine's Day, I loved you the way I'd want to love myself? So while everybody else is out there buying chocolates and flowers and teddy bears for their significant other, taking them out to dinner, what if I loved you the way I would want to love myself? So I will instead just hand you the remote and a bag of chips and say, enjoy, have a great evening, happy Valentine's Day. And she's like, how is that any different than the way you treat me already? And I was like, oh man, I'm just kidding. So anyway, again, since I'm teaching on the golden rule today, I thought I really better try to do this well. So I thought, how could I intentionally love myself well this week? And so I made a list. I'm like, I guess I could take myself out to dinner. I was like, I don't want to worry about the traffic. I was like, maybe I'll buy myself a gift. I was like, I don't want to spend the money. So I landed on I'll write myself a nice note. And that was just too hard. So instead, I landed on I will text myself. And as I went to write out this text message, a love letter to myself, it was really hard to find the words to say. So instead, I decided to send myself something called a Bitmoji, which is like an emoji, but it's a creepy cartoon avatar of yourself doing and saying weird things. So I thought, a picture says 1,000 words. So I sent myself a couple of Bitmojis throughout the week. So a few days ago, I got this text from myself, thinking of you. I was like, it's really nice to know that I'm thinking of me. A few days later, I got another text, you're the best. It's like, finally, somebody notices. And then a few days after that, I was really shocked to get this one. Bless you. I was really blessed to be blessed by me. And so then just yesterday, I got this other text for myself, and it was, I love you times infinity plus one. I was like, oh, that's so meaningful. Obviously, this is really stupid, but what I'm saying is, isn't it true that if you want to find a loophole to a rule, oftentimes you can? So for a rule like the golden rule, where you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, can't I just say, all right, well, my definition of love is to just send creepy cartoons to people. So if that's all that's required of me, great. That's all I'll do. So the story we're going to look at today is a story that Jesus tells to a man who is trying to find a loophole. He's trying to find some justification, an exception to the golden rule. So there's this guy named Luke. He was a doctor back in the first century and also a historian. And he took copious notes about the life and events that surrounded Jesus. He interviewed people, investigated thoroughly what happened, and he wrote it down. We call it the Gospel of Luke, but really it's like Luke's journal. And so we get to actually read that today. And so in the Gospel of Luke, Luke records an event where Jesus is teaching his disciples. And I'm told that when that happened back in that day, you can picture some like green rolling hills. There's like dozens of people seated crisscross applesauce style, looking up at Jesus. Jesus is the only one standing, and he's teaching them. I don't know what he's teaching. He's doing is telling them stories, asking them questions, teaching them. And then Luke tells us this in the Gospel of Luke. He says, one day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. So there's a guy who's in the crowd listening to Jesus, and he's got a question. So he stands up, and he's an expert in the law. So he's really knowledgeable. He's like a lawyer. And the question that he asked Jesus is this. He says, "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Which is a great question. And a loaded question. It was loaded back then and probably feels a little bit loaded now. In fact, we could do like an 8-week, 10-week, 20-week series at unpacking this question, but the gist of the question was simple. What this lawyer was asking is, hey, teacher, Jesus, what is the most important thing? What's the main thing? What matters most to God? Remember, he's there to test Jesus. And so Jesus responds to this lawyer in typical Jesus fashion. He doesn't actually answer him. He asks him a question of his own. So Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" And so the lawyer would have been very familiar with the law of Moses. If you didn't know, like, you might be familiar with the 10 Commandments. You might not know this, but the 10 Commandments were just the first 10. There's actually like over 600 of them. So this guy would have been really familiar with all the laws and how to keep them and how to do them well. And so Jesus says, you tell me, you know the law, tell me, and then we'll both know. And so then the lawyer responds. The man answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, your head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Love God with everything you've got, which was the typical Jewish answer. Like back in that day, this was the standard answer when you were thinking about what matters most to God. It was completely vertical. It was all about loving God with all that you've got. But what's significant about the way the lawyer responds is that he also includes another part, a part that he had heard Jesus include just a few days earlier. Because when Jesus was asked at another instance, what is the greatest commandment? He responded with love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he added on to it, which was completely new. And he said, and the second is equally as important. Love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule. And so this lawyer quotes back to Jesus what he heard Jesus say just previously. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule, to which Jesus would have had a proud teacher moment, right? Like, yes, you got it right. Gold star, A+. You were listening at class the other day. It's not just about a vertical thing. It's also horizontal. If you want to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you've got to love other people as well. But remember, the lawyer was there to trick Jesus. So Jesus, with his proud teacher moment, he responds to this man. He says, right you are. Now do this and you will live. Great answer, great job, A+. But again, the lawyer was there to trick Jesus, and Luke tells us that the man wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? The question that he had up his sleeve, the way that he was going to trap Jesus. Ha 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 ha, who is my neighbor? Another way of saying this question, essentially what he's asking is, what is the minimum amount of neighbor loving required of me in order to get by? Like, who can I exclude? Because if you're saying that the most important thing is not just to love the Lord your God, but to love other people, that seems like a lot of work. So who can I ignore and push to the side, and who do I really have to focus on? Is there a radius? 1 mile, 2 mile, I don't know. Who is my neighbor? And so Jesus again does a very typical Jesus thing. And instead of answering point blank, he tells a story. Luke tells us Jesus replied with a story. And here it is. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. He goes on, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. That's a bad day. He goes on, by chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. And then another person comes along. Jesus says, a temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Let me stop for a second here. So there's this guy, he's a Jewish man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. He gets beat up, he gets his clothes stolen from him, and he's left half dead, naked, baking in the Middle Eastern sun. And then all of a sudden, a priest comes by. Somebody who would have been very familiar with the rules, the law, the 600 commandments I told you, and they would have been a great rule follower as well. They were like professional rule followers. But the first priest, he comes by and he's like, crosses the street and keeps on going. I'm not sure why. The second guy, who's also a religious guy, a temple assistant, he comes by and he does what some of us probably do on the LIE, right? He slows down a little bit and it's like I can't not look, what's going on there. And so I imagine he literally investigates. He goes over to look at this guy and he's probably like, oh, the bone's coming out. Oh man, that stinks. But then he doesn't do anything about it. Again, he crosses over to the other side and keeps on his merry way. I don't know why that these guys just kept on going. Maybe they thought it was a trap. Maybe they thought the guy was a goner. Maybe they didn't want to get unclean right? To be unclean would be to touch somebody who was injured and maybe get blood on you, but they're holy men. They can't be unclean. So maybe they thought they were following the rules. And so instead of doing something for this half-dead man, they crossed the street and kept right on going. And then Jesus tells us there's another guy who passes by. He says, then a despised Samaritan came along, which the word Samaritan doesn't really hold as much weight here in 2021 as it would have back in the first century. See, for the Jewish audience that was listening to the story that Jesus was telling, just hearing the word Samaritan would have made them cringe. Like, oh my gosh, why is he bringing Samaritans into this? Because the Jews and Samaritans hated each other. Jewish people looked down on Samaritans as less than. They were half-breeds. They were heretics. In fact, whenever a Jewish person wanted to travel from northern Israel down to southern Israel, Samaria was kind of in the middle. Rather than just go straight down through Samaria, that would have been the most easy geographical way. They would literally take the time to travel around Samaria just so they wouldn't have to defile the soles of their shoes with the soil of Samaria. So as soon as Jesus would have mentioned the word Samaritan, hearts would have started beating faster in disgust. Why would he be bringing this guy into it? I don't know who your Samaritan might be here today. Maybe Jesus would say it was the despised Republican that came walking by, or despised Democrat. Like the despised Yankee fan walked by, or Met fan, I don't know. But they felt the weight of this and they were disgusted. They would have been disgusted. But Jesus goes on and he tells us what the Samaritan did. He says, when he, the Samaritan, saw the man, the half-dead man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Why don't we dump wine on open wounds anymore? To soothe them, I don't know. This guy, he actually went over to the dude who was baking in the Middle Eastern sun, and he performs first aid on him. Again, the audience listening to Jesus would have thought, if I were the guy who was half dead on the side of the road, I know that I would need to be cared for, but I'm not sure I'd want a Samaritan doing that. I don't think I want a Samaritan touching me. And Jesus would have said, I'm not done yet. Not only does he perform first aid, but then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him there. I don't know what the Samaritan's plans were, but obviously they got thwarted, and he was okay with that. He took the time out to bring this dude to an inn and to care for him in a bed. And again, the audience would have been like, oh my gosh, first of all, there'd be no Samaritan who would ever be this generous and compassionate, and I don't know if I'd ever even want to be touched by it. And Jesus would have said, well, I'm not done yet. Not only did he bring him to the inn, then he goes on. He says, the next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll actually pay you the next time I'm here. Cared for his wounds, got him a room at the inn, and was willing to pay for his stay as long as he needed it in order to get healthy. And then he stops the story right there. And Jesus standing, the lawyer standing in a sea of faces, looking up at them, Jesus peers into the eyes of the lawyer and he asks him this profound question. Looking at the lawyer, he says, now which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? The priest, the temple assistant, the good Samaritan, or the despised Samaritan? Which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Now just imagine for a second that you are the lawyer. Put yourselves in the lawyer's shoes or his uncomfortable first century sandals. Put yourself in his situation. Just think about it for a second. Moments before, you were walking up to this audience, this gathering of people, thinking, this is my moment. I'm going to trap and trick Jesus with this question that I've been thinking about. You were confident and excited. And now the tables have turned, and Jesus is asking you a question, and all eyes are on you. And you can just almost feel the sweat coming down your forehead. You can almost hear the lawyer thinking, why on earth did I ask that stupid question? Shoulders slumped, head down. I imagine in the quietest voice he could possibly speak, after a long pause, he looks up at Jesus and he answers him. But here's the problem. This is the problem that you or I would have if we were the lawyer, and it's certainly the problem that the lawyer had. That however he chose to answer this question, from that moment on, he would then be accountable to the answer that he gave. However he chose to answer, from that moment on, he would then be accountable to the answer that he gave. There would no longer be any justification, any exclusion, any reason to ignore or avoid other people. But he's got a sea of faces looking up at him, waiting for his answer. And so he replies in the quiet voice, shoulders slumped, head down, and he says, it was the one who showed him mercy. The one who was most neighborly was the one who showed him mercy. Notice he couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. It was too difficult. He had to describe him. It was the one who showed him mercy, the one who had compassion. That was who was a neighbor. And Jesus smiles real big, and he looks back at the lawyer, and he says, yes, go and do the same. And if you were there and Jesus were to ask you that question and you were to have answered that it was the one who showed him mercy, he would look into your eyes and he would say, yes, you can go and do the same. See, with one story and one single question, Jesus simultaneously redefines what it looks like to be a neighbor and redefines who our neighbor is. Like with one story and one question, Jesus simultaneously redefines what it is to be a neighbor, who our neighbor is, and he redefines what it looks like to live according to the golden rule. With one story and one question, Jesus demonstrated that everyone now has the capacity to be neighborly, and that everyone is your neighbor. Another way of saying is that everyone has the capacity to love well. And that everybody that you ever come eyeball to eyeball with is somebody to love, regardless of what they look like, where they're from, what their lifestyle is like. That is someone to love. Now, everybody with one story and one question has the capacity to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength by loving a stranger as themselves. With this story and with this question, Jesus makes hero status accessible to all of us. He gives us an example to look to when we're wondering, what's the most important thing, God? What matters most? And notice this, the example that he gives us to look to isn't the rule followers. If it were the rule followers, we would have looked at the priests, the professional rule followers. No, it was the half-breed. It was the despised Samaritan, the nobody, the lowest on the totem pole to a Jewish person. With this one story and one question, Jesus makes hero status available and accessible to everyone. He shows us that the example to look to wasn't the rule followers. It was the guy who had compassion and mercy. It was the one who cared about the thing that God cares about most. People. It was the guy who saw a need and was willing to meet the need. It was the guy who knew the price and was willing to pay the price. It was the one who didn't talk himself out of it. Like, it was the guy that met the needs of somebody who wasn't like him, who didn't talk like him, who didn't look like him, who didn't believe like him. Heck, it was a guy, he met the need of somebody who didn't even like him. He was still willing to do that. He met this person's need, he paid the price, and he didn't talk himself out of it. And Jesus says, hey, that kind of hero status, that's accessible to everyone. That's what matters to me. So I have to ask, like, this week, is there somebody in your life that you could display this kind of love to? Like, you don't have to take on all of the needs of the whole world, but is there one person, maybe in your house or at your job or at school, maybe it's a stranger, one person that Jesus would say, don't overcomplicate it, just look to the Good Samaritan. Just find a need and decide to meet it. Is there one person whose need you can meet? Is there somebody who can't quite pay the price and you can step in and pay it? Maybe you have been talking yourself out of helping this person for weeks or months or whatever, and maybe this is the week that you can say, I'm not going to talk myself out of it, I'm going to do something about it. Is there one person? And it's regardless of what they look like, what church they go to, what they believe. Like Jesus would say, hey, guess what? I don't care if they don't vote like you, if they don't talk like you, if they're not where you're from, if they live a lifestyle that you don't agree with, if they don't agree with the lifestyle that you live. Every person that you come eyeball to eyeball with is your neighbor, a neighbor that I love deeply and want you to love. Was there somebody's need that you could meet this week? And last thing I'll say, and then we'll wrap this up. If, as we were talking, if you're like I can so often be, and whenever you think of God, you tend to default to thinking immediately of rule giver. Right? We've been talking about the golden rule this whole time, right? And so, like, sometimes when I think about God, if I imagine what God's job description is, sometimes I think the title of it is rule giver. And then he's got like one bullet on there: enforce the rules. You know, like that's what God does. Can I just say, like, if that's how you imagine God, that's how you see God, can I ask you to just think about this story that Jesus told? Because honestly, the golden rule is more than something to just obey or ignore. It's more than just a commandment or a mandate or something to obey or ignore or challenge. It really is a reflection of God's love for you and for me. Here's how I know this. Imagine you were the dude who was half dead, naked, baking in the Middle Eastern sun. What would God want for you in that moment? What would Jesus want for you in that moment? He would want other people who are walking by to notice your need and to be willing to step in and meet that need. Again, imagine this. Imagine that just on your street alone, that all of your neighbors, or in your apartment complex, or in your dorm, imagine that everybody who lived in your vicinity took this rule seriously. They chose to, like, care for you, notice you, identify needs that you had, and step in and meet them, maybe pay prices you couldn't pay. They wouldn't talk themselves out of it. Imagine they took that seriously. Now imagine that really is God's desire for them. That would mean that God has created everybody on your block or everybody in this world to love you well. If God has created everybody on this planet to love you well, what does that say about how God feels about you? What does that say about how God sees you? What he thinks of you? I think it says that he loves you deeply. He cares for you so much. He'd be willing to do anything for you because just shortly after this encounter that Jesus has with the lawyer, shortly after that, God was going to put on a display of neighborly love himself that would be unmatched. And it was going to cost way more than just 2 nights stay in a hotel. Just shortly after this encounter with the lawyer, God was going to do something for the whole world, express love for the whole world. You see, when God looked at the world and looked at everyone, including you and me, he noticed that there was a need. I talked about that a little bit in part 1 of this series. And instead of ignoring it and crossing the other side of the street and just leaving it, he chose to step in and meet that need and pay that price. not because he wants you to be the best rule follower on earth or because he wants you to just obey him somewhat, but because he truly loves you and he loves me. And so it doesn't have to, but if the thought of God caring about you that much excites you even just a little bit, or like encourages you even just a little bit, would you consider this week, would you consider becoming a hero? Like being like the Good Samaritan? Would you consider loving God back, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength simply by choosing to love someone else as yourself? Maybe even a stranger. Can we pray together? Oh, Heavenly Father, just thank you so much. Thank you for preserving this text. Like, thank you for preserving Dr. Luke's notes for us. Like, so that we could read about the events that happened in Jesus' life, the stories that he told. We can be encouraged by them and inspired by what Jesus said. And ultimately, so that we can get a glimpse of how you really feel about us, about our neighbors. I just ask, God, that you would help us all this week, Lord, to live out like the story of the Good Samaritan, to be willing to step into somebody's life and meet their need or pay their price, God, and to like push aside any justifications that we try to make or excuses, and with open arms just choose to love. And thank you that you are so good, that you are willing to meet our needs and love us. I pray this in Jesus' name.